There's something fascinating about the human brain we tend to trust. Our eyes almost completely. When you see a clear, golden glass of beer, you usually assume it will be light and easy to drink, the kind of beer perfect for a relaxing afternoon. But when a dark beer is placed in front of someone, many people have the exact same first reaction. They pause for a moment, look at the deep-colored liquid, and ask, "This must be pretty strong." Right. In reality, your brain has just played a small trick on you. Color pushes us to make extremely quick judgments. Dark colors often suggest something
8%.
bold, intense,
All right, let's see what you got.
or even powerful. It's similar to how we assume dark chocolate will taste more bitter, or that black coffee must be stronger.
The
But
deep
in the world
richness
of
of dark
beer,
chocolate meets the intense
the dark
bitterness of
color
black
is
coffee.
sometimes nothing
Two
more than a
powerful
very
flavors,
convincing
perfectly
disguise.
balanced.
There are dark beers that look like a giant glass of espresso, yet their alcohol content is actually lower than that of an ordinary can of pale lager. So an interesting question immediately appears. If dark beer isn't necessarily stronger,
Why does dark
why
beer
does it
look so heavy?
The answer comes from a rather unexpected place. The roasting kiln for barley. Most people assume that the color of beer reflects its strength. At first glance, that idea seems logical. Strong spirits are usually darker, while lighter drinks often appear clear and bright. But beer follows a completely different rule. The color of beer mainly comes from how the barley is roasted before brewing. Barley is the primary grain used to make beer. Much like grapes are the key ingredient in wine. And just like coffee beans,
Smells incredible.
barley
They
can be
hit the
roasted at
target
different
roast
levels.
Exactly.
When the grain is lightly
Absolutely,
roasted,
we're ready to mill.
it stays pale yellow. Beers made from this type of barley are typically light in color, much like the familiar lagers many people drink. But when the barley is roasted longer, the color gradually changes. It turns amber, then deep brown, and eventually becomes almost completely black. Imagine putting a slice of bread into a toaster. If you take it out after 1 minute, it's just slightly golden. Leave it in a bit longer, and it becomes a nicely toasted slice. But if you forget it inside the toaster, the color quickly turns dark brown. Barley goes through a very similar process. And the interesting part is that this process has almost nothing to do with the alcohol content of the beer. In other words, you can brew a beer that looks extremely dark, but is actually quite light. The color comes from heat, not from alcohol. This is where the story becomes a little amusing. Take a famous example, Guinness. It's the iconic dark beer with a creamy foam head that you often see in Irish pubs, where bartenders patiently pour it in 2 stages so the foam can settle perfectly. Just by looking at its color, many people immediately assume that it must be a very strong beer. The color of Guinness is nearly as dark as coffee, and when poured into a glass, the liquid often appears thicker and heavier than bright golden lagers. That visual impression alone leads many people to a quick conclusion. Dark beer must be stronger, richer, and more intoxicating. But when you look at the actual numbers,
patiently
the
waited
reality
for.
becomes quite surprising.
Discover the
A standard pint of Guinness
unparalleled
contains about
richness of Guinness Stout.
2% alcohol. To put that into perspective, many popular pale lagers on the market typically range from 5% to 5%. In other words, in many cases, the dark beer you assumed was strong may actually be lighter than the pale beer you usually drink. Calories tell a similar story. A pint of Guinness contains a little over 200 calories, while some common pale beers can contain even more than that. This means that in terms of energy,
People always assume the dark
that
beer
dark
must
glass
contain
of beer
strong
may
alcohol,
not be as
don't
heavy
they?
as we tend to imagine. So why do many people still feel that dark beer tastes stronger and heavier? The answer lies in its flavor and texture.
When we
Dark
compare
beers
pale lagers
often
in this
carry
range,
notes of
say
chocolate,
4.5 to 5%,
coffee,
the differences are subtle
and
but
toasted
significant.
bread.
Wait,
These
look at this.
flavors
It's actually
naturally
clear.
signal richness to our brain,
I thought this was a stout.
making us automatically label
It
the
smells
drink as
amazing,
something
though.
intense. It's similar to drinking a mocha. The cocoa flavor can make the coffee feel stronger, even though the caffeine content may not be very different from a latte.
We found
Our
that stronger
brains
flavor
sometimes
equals
struggle
stronger
to
perception,
distinguish
even when
between
the
a
strength
flavor
levels
that
are
feels
identical.
bold
Wow, the red
and a
one
drink
really hit
that is
me.
They're
actually
exactly the
stronger.
same.
To better understand what is happening, we need to talk about a very famous chemical reaction in the world of food, the Maillard reaction. This reaction occurs when sugars and proteins are exposed to high heat. It is the same process that creates the delicious brown crust on a steak, the irresistible aroma of freshly baked cookies, or the caramelized top of a creme brulee. If you have ever smelled bread coming out of the oven, you have already experienced the Maillard reaction at work. When barley grains are roasted to make beer, this reaction happens as well. Under high temperatures, the chemical structure inside the grain begins to change, producing hundreds of different flavor compounds. Some of these compounds carry notes of chocolate.
That transforms the flavor
Some
and color
resemble
of food.
roasted
It's responsible
coffee,
for the rich brown
and others evoke the smell of toasted bread with slightly charred edges. When you drink a dark beer, all of these flavors activate different sensory areas in your brain at the same time, and your brain begins to interpret those signals in a very familiar way. Chocolate, that sounds rich. Coffee, that must be strong. Toasted bread with charred edges, that feels heavy. But most of those sensations come from aroma and flavor, not from the actual alcohol content in the beer. On top of that, many dark beers, such as Guinness, use nitrogen to create their foam, instead of relying only on carbon dioxide, like most beers do. Nitrogen produces extremely tiny bubbles, giving the foam a creamy texture and making the mouthfeel smoother and thicker. This is why the beer can feel silky, almost like drinking a carbonated cappuccino. When your eyes see the dark color, your tongue senses the creamy texture, and your nose detects roasted coffee aromas. Your brain almost automatically assumes the drink must be very strong. But in reality, that is not necessarily the case.
It suppresses the carbonation.
The world of
and
beer
gives the
can
beer
sometimes
its smooth,
feel like a
creamy
small
texture
stage
and dense
performance.
head.
The color, the foam, and the aromas work like costumes dressing up the main character. A dark beer may look like a giant glass of espresso, making us assume it is powerful and heavy. Yet behind that deep color, it can actually be lighter than many bright golden beers. In other words, our brains are being tricked by sight and flavor. We see the dark color, smell hints of coffee, and instantly conclude that the drink must be high in alcohol. So, the next time someone says they avoid dark beer because it must be too strong, you can smile a little. Black does not always mean powerful. In the world of beer, sometimes it is simply an extremely convincing disguise. And if the idea of how taste can fool us feels interesting, there is another fun question to explore.
Black
what would happen
does not
if we followed a
always
barley
mean
grain
strong.
from the moment it was alive in the field
Black
all
tastes
the way
tough
to
and
the
charred.
moment it is roasted dark inside a kiln? It turns out that the moment that looks almost burnt is actually the moment when some of beer's most beautiful flavors begin to be born.